Okay, great. We'll see Journal Club again a bit later on. So we've heard the passage read to us, and I must say I've really enjoyed going through this chapter, this story this week in preparation for today. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity to explore it some more now. Well, there's a video that went viral a few years ago of a boy being warned by his dad that his bad behaviour was going to land him on Santa's naughty list. The boy is outraged at this suggestion, saying, well, in that case, Father Christmas isn't being very nice to me. The argument goes on, and the only other comment I'll make on it is this. The boy's final threat to punch Santa's beard off probably wasn't the reaction that the dad was looking for in that case. Well, now that's an extreme reaction to the idea of being put on a naughty list as such. But there is this idea out there that Santa is, as the song goes, making a list and checking it twice. Well, maybe we don't take that idea very seriously, but I wonder whether we can sometimes allow that way of thinking to creep into how we think about God. Where God becomes someone we make sure we're on our best behaviour around if we want things to go well. That maybe a route we're happy to keep him at arm's length as long as we get the stuff he can give us. Or maybe there are times when you mess up and you worry you've got yourself on God's naughty list. So then you've got to work hard to get back in his good books. Or maybe it's the other way around, and you've had a pretty good run of things, and you look for a kind of bonus blessing as a result. Well, as we come to the next part of our story today, we'll see a very different picture of how God cares for his people. Because instead we'll see his abundant grace and provision for his people, how grace is found in a barley field. So let's get started and take a look at Ruth chapter 2 together. Now, if you remember back to last week, chapter 1 ended on a small note of hope. Naomi and Ruth have returned just as the barley harvest is beginning. And what a harvest it will turn out to be. But first, chapter 2 begins with an introduction to a new character in the story. So who is this guy? Well, firstly, he's a relative of Naomi's on her late husband's side. So he could be in a position to help them, perhaps. And not only that, he is a man of standing, our text says. And this is basically saying he's a great guy. He's a top bloke. He's someone well loved in the community. He's a man of moral worth and material wealth. And his name? Boaz. Which means in him is strength. You get the feeling he is going to be a good guy to get to know. But then in verse 2, we're back at home with Ruth and Naomi. And here we see something more of Ruth's character. She's not content to just sit around waiting for something to happen. No, she's proactive. She wants to provide and care for Naomi, so she sets out to find work. And you'll never believe whose field she finds work in. Yes, it's Boaz's field. Of all the fields in all of Bethlehem, she's come to work in Boaz's. The storyteller uses a telling phrase here in verse 3. It says, as it turned out. We might say, as luck would have it, or it just so happened. But of course, this is no accident. Just as it's no accident that they've arrived back at the start of the barley harvest. This phrase is like a big flashing sign saying there's something bigger going on here. Ruth is in this very field at this very time for a reason. God is clearly at work here. So let's see what happens next. Well, Ruth does a solid morning's work, and then just before lunchtime, Boaz himself enters the scene. And the storyteller, again, goes out of his way to show what a great guy Boaz is, especially in his generosity to others. Well, firstly, he's a great boss. Look at the greeting he gives his harvesters there in verse 4. "The Lord be with you." It's a word of blessing, and his team respond in kind. If we remember the backdrop to this story, we're in the time of the Judges, a time when faithfulness to God was pretty rare, and yet here's a man blessing people in the Lord's name. Well, not only that, but later on at mealtime, he's right there alongside the rest of them, eating and serving food. If Boaz was chairman of Bethlehem FC, he wouldn't be up in the director's box. No, he'd be right there in the stands with all the fans. There's a warmth and a humility to Boaz's actions here. But it's in Boaz's interactions with Ruth that we really see his abundant generosity at work. You see, right from the off, even before he knows who she is, he's looking out for her. Perhaps his question in verse 5, we read it, he says, "Who does that young woman belong to?" To our ears in this context, it seems like quite an odd question, perhaps. But in the context of the time, he's checking that she's being looked after and provided for. Especially because it would be clear that she was a foreign woman, she was not from Israel, and perhaps therefore especially vulnerable at that time. And then once they start talking in verse 8, his first priority is to offer her protection and job security. You see, understanding more of the cultural context is helpful here. The work Ruth is doing, gleaning behind those harvesting the barley, this was part of God's social provision for the poor, a kind of social safety net. As we read in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the law, we read that farmers were not to harvest right to the edges of their fields, and they were not to pick up any stray grains that fell down as they harvested. Instead, they were to leave them to be gathered up by the poor and the foreigners who were living in the land, and this is what Ruth was doing. But this was an evil and a lawless time, and for a woman, especially a single young foreign woman like Ruth, well, this kind of work came with huge risks of harassment or even assault. Moabites particularly were seen as enemies of Israel, which would put her at even more risk. And we see that the Boaz is immediately sensitive to this, and he puts measures in place to protect her. He assures her of a safe place to work in his field among the other women already working there. But that's not all. He also provides for her in really an outrageously generous way. Firstly, he gives her a free pass to drink from the water jars the men had filled. That may not seem that much to us today, but at that time, men would not have made the drinks for the women, and Israelites would not have made drinks for foreigners. It would have been the other way round. And yet here, Ruth, a Moabite woman, is given free rein to drink from what the Israelite men have filled. It's an extraordinarily generous offer for the time. And then later at mealtime, she's invited to have an honoured place at the table. She's encouraged to eat all she wants, with leftovers aplenty to take home in a box. A plentiful meal with leftovers gathered up afterwards. I wonder whether that reminds us of any other stories that happen later in the Bible, perhaps the feeding of the 5,000. And all this is in a context where there had recently been famine in the land. So it's a hugely generous gesture. As one commentator puts it, Boaz takes an ordinary event and transforms it into a magnanimous occasion for compassion, generosity, and acceptance. But then we see that the generosity doesn't stop there. As they get ready to carry on after lunch, Boaz has a quiet word with his men, and he asks them to do something even more extraordinary. Well, he asked them to casually drop not just the odd grain here and there, but whole stalks and sheaves of barley to take out of the sheaves to drop them for Ruth to gather. You can kind of imagine them going along that afternoon, going, "Oh, well, let's just gather up these stalks here. Let's gather up all together. Oh, whoops! Oh, just chucked a load on the floor. Whoopsie, never mind." That's the kind of thing he was asking them to do. It's almost comical. And it's not that Ruth wasn't working hard, she really was. But Boaz is going out of his way to ensure she has a very fruitful day's work indeed. And then when it comes to taking stock at the end of the day, she's gathered a bumper harvest, an ephah of barley. That in modern measurements, you can see in your text at the bottom there, it says it's probably about 13 kilograms, we think, maybe about 30 odd pounds of barley. And that's probably around 10 days worth of food she's gathered in just one day. This isn't just being generous of us. This is extraordinary, abundant generosity, far beyond what Ruth could have imagined as she set out that morning. She went looking for work, and she has found a field of grace. So the storyteller has gone out of their way to show just how extraordinary this generosity is, and to show what a good and godly man Boaz is, using his wealth and status for the good of others. He's a faithful man in an age of faithlessness, a generous man in a time of scarcity and famine, a protector in a time of lawlessness. Well, what an amazing day it's been for Ruth. As she heads back home, laden with as much food as she could carry. That's the best. It might have been quite like that, but something a bit like that. She comes home carrying this massive sack of barley and her leftover lunch as well. And as she arrives home, Naomi's jaw just hits the floor. She can hardly believe what she's seeing. And then, when she hears that this is all from Boaz's fields, well, she feels something that she has not felt for a long time. Hope. Hope because she recognises God's hand at work in Ruth arriving in Boaz's field. Hope because she sees how God, through Boaz, is showing such kindness to them. Before, when she first arrived back, she felt that God's hand was against her. But now she sees God's hand working for them, providing all they need and more. The chapter closes then with another summary, telling us that Ruth takes Boaz's advice and stays with the women working for him through not only the barley harvest, but the wheat harvest as well. I'll have to wait till next time to see what more might happen with Ruth and Boaz. But for now, let's take a few minutes to consider what we can learn from the events of this story. Because of all the different interactions and conversations in this chapter, I think verses 10 to 12 particularly give a deeper insight into both Boaz and Ruth. So first off, in verse 10, we see Ruth's humble response to Boaz's generosity. She bows down and says, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" You see, there's no pretense here. She is genuinely stunned at the favour he has shown her. She is under no illusions about her place in the social hierarchy of the time, which makes her all the more thankful for the grace that is shown to her. There's no sense of entitlement here, no presumption. And in that, she sets a beautiful pattern for us to follow. Because if we're honest, it can be all too easy to let a sense of entitlement creep in, especially around Christmas time. The desire and the pressure to have everything just right can lead to feeling that, well, if we just work hard enough, we'll be owed a good time. Or maybe the hope for getting the presents we want can just edge into feeling that we're entitled to get whatever we want for Christmas. Perhaps we're feeling like, well, after the last 20 months, and especially after last Christmas, that we're owed a good Christmas this year. And that is an understandable feeling to have. But the problem with that kind of thinking is that, well, it always backfires in the end, doesn't it? Things are never quite as perfect as we hope they'll be. Whether it's burnt food or broken toys, arguments, or just the sadness at those not with us, our hopes can be so easily dashed. But if we take the attitude shown by Ruth here of owning our dependence on God for everything, of receiving then what God gives us with humility, recognizing it's all a gift of his grace. Well, if we take this attitude, well, then we'll be humbly thankful for what does come to us. We'll be able to accept that things won't always be as we wish them to be. Perhaps such an attitude better prepares us to receive and celebrate the greatest and most undeserved Christmas gift of all, the Lord Jesus coming to live among us and to save us. So that's what we can learn from Ruth's humility here. But what of Boaz's words here? Well, Boaz's words in verses 11 and 12 are also highly significant because he shows a deeper understanding of the significance of the events unfolding there in Bethlehem. He knows and honours the sacrifices Ruth has made to stick by Naomi, loving and caring for her even in a strange land. But he also sees how she has sought refuge in God, the God under whose wings she has come to take refuge, as he says in verse 12. So he prays for blessing to come to her through this, because she has sought shelter under the protection of the God who is the source of all blessing. God is pictured here like a protective bird offering shelter to any who seek refuge under his wings. The protection and security that Boaz has shown her is really just a part of God's wider provision and protection for both her and Naomi. And I think something else to learn from Ruth here is how she responds to the suffering she has faced. The pain she has found of being a young widow, of seeing her hopes seemingly falling apart. And her response was not to run away from and reject God, but to turn towards him, to run to him for refuge. This is a stark contrast to Elimelech's response to the famine back at the start of chapter 1, where they ran away to Moab. Now she has come back to God. She has turned to God. And perhaps when we face such times, as we all will and do, it can be so easy to be tempted to do the opposite, to blame God, to rail at him and reject him. Or perhaps we might feel unable or unworthy to bring all our mess to him. But somehow Ruth, the Moabite who did not know the Lord before, she knew that the comfort and hope she longed for were not to be found anywhere else, but only in the Lord God of Israel. May we know that same comfort and hope when we face such times in our own lives. But just in these last couple of minutes, let's take a step back and think of and see how all this fits into the Bible's bigger picture. Because sure, we've seen how great a character Boaz is, haven't we? But ultimately, I think the Bible story, it leads us to not just look at Boaz, but to look through Boaz to his greatest descendant, Jesus. And one of the details we learn from Naomi near the end of the chapter is that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer. Now that's a specific term for one who has a special responsibility for caring for family members in need. And we'll see more about the detail of that as events play out in chapters 3 and 4. But even here, even in this first encounter, we've seen how Boaz beautifully captures what it looks like to be a redeemer. See, first, he sees Ruth's need for help, for protection and provision. Then he covers the cost to meet her need. He covers the cost by providing out of his own resources for her and for Naomi. Then he elevates her to a new status of dignity and honour amongst his workers. And he brings her into a supportive community of the fellow workers, of the women that she'd be working alongside. He gives her community. And really, that's just the start of what we'll see him do. But then as we look through Boaz, we can see how he points towards the ways that Jesus is our Redeemer. Because Jesus also sees our needs. our need for rescue and redemption. And what's more, Jesus pays the price to rescue us, the price of our redemption paid on the cross. He then raises us to a new status as children of God, something we could hardly dared hope for, just as Ruth could hardly have dared to hope for what happened to her that day in the barley field. And then finally, Jesus brings us into the community of his people, the church, both now and into eternity. So we see that's the redemption that God works for his people through our great Redeemer, Jesus. Boaz is, if you like, Boaz is like an outline or a template of a Redeemer that Jesus then comes later and perfectly colours in for us. And then Ruth's response to Boaz, well, that sets the pattern for our response as well. Humbly marvelling at the incredible, generous, abundant provision of grace made by our Redeemer, Jesus. Well, as a way of kind of responding to this, we're going to listen to a song now. It's one of the songs from the playlist that's on our Advent devotionals, so you'll probably come across it next week if you're going through that. But let's use this now as an opportunity to reflect on God's abundant, generous grace to us. It's called The Unbelievable, so let's listen to this and reflect on it now.